One of the tracks the Beach Boys had recorded for 2020, their last album for Capitol, was an arrangement that Al Jardine and Brian Wilson had made of the old Huddie Ledbetter song Cotton Fields. Eventually, Capitol decided that they wanted to release the song as a single, so the group returned to the studios and recorded a rearranged and punchier version for the singles market. Cotton Fields, and that record reached number 5 in the British charts in June 1970. The success of that single in Britain prompted EMI to put it as the opening track on the Sunflower album, which they released on their stateside label in Britain. Although the group were now with Warner Brothers in America, their contract with EMI in Europe still had a while to run. So Cotton Fields was never really intended for Sunflower. It isn't included on the American version, and to my mind doesn't really seem to fit with the rest of the LP. Anyway, a couple of songs that Bruce Johnson wrote for the album were Deirdre and Tears in the Morning, and the latter appeared as their next single in Britain.
I think Tears in the Morning was too pop. It just doesn't fit the group. It was my mistake. I think it's a lovely song, a lovely arrangement, but it's just not right for our group.
What about Deirdre?
I don't even like Deirdre. I rewrote it and made it a lot funkier. It's too saccharine-y. I was just experimenting with those songs, but I think now I wouldn't put them in. I wouldn't even cut them like that if I were cutting them now. And I wish I never had recorded them with the group. I don't think it helped the group at all.
Bruce Johnston being very frank about his own compositions. In August 1970, Jack Riley came to work for the Beach Boys, ostensibly to handle press and publicity. In his previous capacity as a journalist, he'd interviewed them for a public service radio network in America, and later Bruce and Mike had asked him if he would work for the group.
Part of the tacit agreement under which I would come to work with the Beach Boys is they'd have to agree to change a few things around. And one of the things, and we did it in a series of advertisements, was to just say it right out. It's safe now to listen to the Beach Boys. And I remember that was a headline in one of the first ads we ran. You have to remember, and listeners in England might find this puzzling, but Pet Sounds was not a successful recording by Beach Boys standards in the United States, unlike England. We ran another ad, I remember. I got a letter from somebody. I think it was from Houston, Texas. A guy who said he walked into his record store and bought a Beach Boys album, but he sandwiched it between one by Jethro Tull and one by some other group. And he just didn't want it to be too well known by his buddies that he was listening to the Beach Boys. And we used that story in an ad. It was sort of silly, but people were afraid to say they were into the Beach Boys. I think 2020 and Sunflower had been real disasters sales-wise, although Sunflower is one of the finest recordings I've ever heard by anybody. Okay, so we got rid of the white suits and we started addressing ourselves to the real problem in the media, started doing concerts unlike those which the Beach Boys had done in the past. We had an offer to play at the Big Sur Folk Festival in Monterey with Joan Baez and some other people. Anyway, part of the agreement was that they would do it. They did so without Brian, but nevertheless the group was extremely successful and it was just what we really needed to get things rolling. They had not done festivals before. I'm not sure why, though. Some people in the group seemed really apprehensive about them, but I remember we changed the order of the songs in the performance round drastically, dropped some numbers entirely, threw in some album cuts, which they hadn't done on stage much, and I thought it was a great show. I remember it very well now. It was an outdoor show.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beach Boys.
Oh, the name of this song is Wouldn't It Be Nice If We Were Older and we wouldn't have to wait so long? And wouldn't it be nice to live together in the kind of room where we belong? You know what's gonna make it that much better if we can say goodnight and stay together. Wouldn't it be nice if we could wake up in the morning when
Very nice. And I think that's really what started things. Shortly thereafter, we got an offer to play Carnegie Hall in New York from two fellows who had not really been promoters ever, Mike Klenfner, who is now a successful promotion man with Columbia Records, and Chip Racklin, who is now the Beach Boys' agent. He is with International Famous New York. And two very green promoters who offered much too much money for the Beach Boys to do a performance at Carnegie Hall. Of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, there was actually discussion about it. I can't remember why. But we took the offer, and that was the other thing that really pushed things over in a very, very strong way. And I think the Beach Boys have a lot to thank Mike and Chip for that offer in regaining a lot of what they had lost, particularly in the United States.
The recording of the Beach Boys at the Big Sur Monterey Folk Festival is on an album called Celebration, and other artists on that LP include Joan Baez, Linda Ronstadt, Mary Clayton, Country Joe McDonald and Chris Christopherson, and the proceeds went to the Institute for the Study of Non-Violence. As Jack Riley mentioned, another important turning point for the group was the concert they did in February 1971 at the Carnegie Hall, New York, and one of the two guys who organised it was Chip Racklin.
For a time I was working at the Fillmore, and some friends of mine and I knew that the Fillmore would not book them because they hadn't drawn very well. And because we wanted to see the group, we decided to see if Carnegie Hall was available. This was November 70. And we arranged for a date in February for the boys to play at Carnegie Hall. At this point, there was no professional affiliation. It was just a group of people who wanted to see them get a shot. And we worked for about 4 months on that concert, and it eventually sold out the night of the show.
And at Carnegie Hall, we did the show alone. It was a 2-hour concert, and that was very, very new. There was no opening act. Instead of the Beach Boys going on and being a jukebox of 45 minutes of their latest hits, they instead did 2 hours and really did some good artistic material. I think that part of this was in response, frankly, to the November-December 1970 European and British tour, in which the Beach Boys did 45, 50 minutes. They were terribly dissatisfied with it. Some of the critics didn't like it, and it wasn't the group. And so we changed all that. At that time, it was the old boom, boom, on and off with a strange guy, not a very good comedian. I can't remember his name, but I can remember the jokes, and they were very sad. And a couple of opening acts. They wouldn't last very long. We also had The Flame with us. It was Ricky, Blondie, and Ricky's two brothers. It was just bad. It was really bad. Well, that tour was, for us, from an artistic standpoint, a disastrous tour. And I think it was with that I was able to sell the group completely on the idea of being themselves. I think that certainly 50% of the people who come to their concerts are there to hear Brian Wilson's music. And by that I mean the music from Pet Sounds and to before. And I think that's fantastic because I happen to love that music. But I know that there's other music they do as well. And I've never been personally as gratified as I was when I think it was Long Promised Road got the biggest ovation in the show. That's on Surf's Up. So I think it was accepted by people. We didn't want to have people turn off to what the Beach Boys were, but only to be aware that there was still stuff going on, and it was also very exciting music, and still is.
So hard to answer futures.
Well, that's a superb recording. Carl's Long Promised Road from the Surf's Up album, released in the autumn of 1971. Both this one and the previous LP, Sunflower, were released in quadraphonic sound, but at the moment on the radio in this country, at least, we'll have to make do with stereo. Going back to Sunflower for a moment, there's a line on the back cover that says, P.S. Thanks to Nick from all the Beach Boys. Well, by the end of 1971, the relationship between the group and their business manager, Nick Grillo, had gone sour.
The departure from the Boys came quite suddenly. We were having some problems in terms of career direction and problems concerning finances. Some of the boys wanted to be more involved actively in the financial aspect of their careers, which always bothered me, and I wish some of them had shown the same amount of enthusiasm when it came to cutting material. I think the part that disturbed me more than anything else is that I guess they had the right to dismiss anyone that they wanted to dismiss, but it was the way it was done. I was notified from the road by my associate, my colleague, that I was not to return to the office beyond a certain point. I think it was on a Thursday, and I think Friday was my last day. I did receive a call from Carl, and it seemed to me that possibly some of these differences could have been resolved, and he was to call me back, and he never did. And I believe there was an attempt by certain people in the organization to shield the boys from me and not give me an opportunity to defend myself on certain allegations that had developed that I was not a party to, which is very painful. I felt that an injustice was perpetrated. A year later, other dismissals took place, and I think that, in essence, that sort of, I feel in my own mind, exonerated me from a lot of the ill will that had taken place.
When Derek Taylor had worked as a publicist for the Beach Boys in the 60s, he'd seen how hard Nick Grillo worked for the group and just how aware they were of their money.
Very aware of it and very silly with money, but they all needed it. I mean, when I say all, now I'm talking about the four who had control, which is the brothers and the cousin, Mike, and very, very interested in money, huge spenders, and then the usual desire to wrangle with the record company, which happens at some point in every successful band's career. Where's our money? Insist on audits and all that. So money, 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 money. A lot of the time, yes. But not mean with it, you know. Nick Grillo, their manager then, business manager, was in the hottest seat in the world. I never saw a man under more pressure than Nick Grillo in my life. Seen many people under pressure, but never anyone under the pressure Nick Grillo was under. There was so many of them, first of all buying and selling cars, houses, or whatever. I mean, and all changing their minds. God, for mind changing. You've just reminded me of a whole new area opened up in my mind when I think of Nick Grillo. A work freak anyway, sort of Des Brown type. 20 hours of work, fantastic, you know. But no drinking either, no eating, no time for anything, poor Nick. And that all turned to ashes in the end, I think, as well. I used to wonder, how the hell can this man go through all this without even moaning? Because I'm, as an habitual moaner myself, even when I'm doing well, always got some good moan going about something. But you'd never hear it, never complained to his Nick thought whatever he did for them, or whatever sort of hell he went through, was the reward was somewhere in heaven, because these people were rather heavenly people. And it was okay. It's just the boys, you know. It's just the boys being... Boys will be boys. He had backed Nick anywhere, and he backed me. Fine.
But evidently not as far as the Beach Boys were concerned, for the severance of the relationship ended in a series of lawsuits in which Nick Grillo sued the Beach Boys and Jack Riley for monies he alleged they owed him, and they countersued, alleging mismanagement of some of their financial affairs.
No matter what the settlement was, I feel that it was unjust, and of course they feel that it was unjust. No one is particularly satisfied on the settlement. The only people that made money on this deal were the attorneys, and man, they ripped everybody off.
Meanwhile, the Surf's Up album, as well as being recognised as a true artistic achievement, was also selling well, and this time there was a Bruce Johnston song on it that he actually liked.
Now, I think Disney Girls does fit the Beach Boys. I came up with that song because I saw so many kids in our audience just be wiped out on drugs, and I mean really bad drugs, that I was trying to think of a time when I was really young and what it was like, and also being really naive. And I thought, well, let's see, 1957, what was going on in 1957 in my life? And I thought of a funny record. Well, it's not funny, it's old, so it seems funny to me. It's called Old Cape Cod by Patti Page, and it was a big hit here. So I started thinking about what I was doing, that record, and I wrote a song about going back in time, which is kind of dumb, you know, like American Graffiti. I remember back in 57 and 58 and 59, you know, I was like 13 years old, and I was afraid to go on to high school which is 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, because I always thought I was going to get beaten up. Anyway, I realized now how tame those times were, and I was thinking, gee, wouldn't it be nice to just go back there for a minute? Because it's just so hard these days with everybody kind of nodding out and overdosing, and that's kind of what the song is about, just people being a little naive but a little healthier.
Cloudy page and summer days.
Disney Girls, 1957, written by Bruce Johnston. But early in 1972, a statement was issued that Bruce had left the group by mutual consent.
The last tour I was on, I kind of felt strange because the group had gotten kind of clubby again. You had two guys, Mike and Al, that were deeply involved in meditation. You had Carl and Ricky that were kind of tight. You had Blondie, who was kind of alone, and Dennis wasn't quite sure of his role because he had an accident with his hand and he couldn't play drums for a long time, and he was trying to get used to the role of finally singing. And so the group kind of felt a little uncomfortable with each other, and we just kind of decided that it would be better to not play together and feel comfortable. And it was probably the right thing for me to do because now the friendship's better. And anyway, I had some music and some things that I wanted to do that I really couldn't do in the group. I mean, we must be friends because we've sung on a lot of sessions together since then, and I've sung on a few Beach Boy albums, and I occasionally play with the group, so there's no bad feeling between anybody.
At that time, there was still no sign of Brian on the road, and some people had almost begun to wonder if he was really still around. A problem for the group and for Jack Riley.
We didn't want to give an illusion of something which did not exist, and how to get over that, I think, was a big problem. I think we did it simply by just trying to encourage him to go into the studio more frequently. This culminated when one day I was going to Warner Brothers. I was driving to Warner Brothers, and I thought I'd stop at Brian's. I was going to have a meeting with Mo Austin, and I said, Brian, why don't you come with me, see Mo? And he said, okay, I will. He said, the president of Warner Brothers, I don't know what I'm going to tell him. We started on the drive over to Burbank from Bel Air. And suddenly Brian said, well, all right, if you're going to force me, then I'll do it. This was out of nowhere. And I said, force you to do what, Brian? And he said, to put Surf's Up on the album. I had talked to him about putting the song Surf's Up on the next album, which at that time was tentatively titled Landlocked. And this was the first album with which I would have had an association. And I said, you mean you're really going to do it? And he said, well, if you're going to force me. And it was a fantastic thing, and I loved it. And we got into Warner Brothers, and with no coaxing at all, Brian said to Mo, well, I'm going to put Surf's Up on the album. And I think this was something that helped us a great deal, really, because it did provide a commitment on Brian's part to become very active in the studio. And in my way of thinking, still, and I listen to a lot of records these days, there's some marvelous artists out there, but to my ears, there's still no one who can accomplish things in production as Brian can.
A diamond necklace played the pawn.
My involvement in the Beach Boys stemmed from a desire to have them heard by more people. My desire to have Surf's Up on the album was because I wanted to have the record. A very selfish motivation, I'm afraid. Carl did a tremendous amount of work. Brian did some work on it as well. We did the entire track on the first section over again and then scrapped it because it didn't quite come up to the original track. Carl had to sing the lead on the first portion of the record. He didn't want to. We wanted Brian to initially, and I think psychologically there was so much intensification that Brian was the only person who could sing that part that when Brian decided ultimately not to, it put Carl in a difficult position because he too was sucked into that myopic viewpoint, as was Steve Desper, the engineer of the Beach Boys, and was I, that was Brian that had to sing that. But I remember Carl and I sat in the studio, which at that time was at Brian's house, for, a couple of hours, one late afternoon, early evening, and Brian was somewhere else in the house, I don't know where, and Carl suddenly hit that high note that's included in the first portion twice, in the first and second verse, and he really did it well. He read that lyric beautifully. The second portion is Brian from the original recording. Then the final portion, the tag, "The child was the father of the man" portion, is something we all got involved in. I know Alan has a very important part in that. Carl sings a couple of parts. Michael, I'm on it. A guy who worked for us part-time named Bill DeSimone sings on it. He just sings "Hey, hey," but it's integral to the tag of that record. That was a lot of fun doing the tag of Surf's Up. And the lyric, which Van Dyke Parks put to the song, is my favorite lyric of all time. I think it's one that has to be read very carefully, done very, very carefully.
And considering that Jack Riley wrote the very fine lyrics to some of the other songs on the Surf's Up album, his remarks are praise indeed. Incidentally, on A Day in the Life of a Tree, which Jack wrote with Brian, he was eventually talked into singing the lead vocal for the song by Brian. By the next album, however, even more help was at hand in the shape of Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar, who Bruce Johnston mentioned earlier. They'd originally been part of a South African group called Flame, which the Beach Boys first saw in Blazes Club in London. Carl had then produced an album with them in America, but the group didn't have too much success, and after disbanding, Ricky and Blondie first toured as backup musicians with the Beach Boys, and then joined the group officially in March 1972.
Jack Riley had this idea to have me and Blondes join the group, and I just thought it was just so ridiculous. It just didn't seem possible because it seemed like such a tight-knit family thing, you know. And when we first joined the group, it was weird adjusting, you know, because we were always being asked questions. The most aggravating one after a while was, how does it feel being a Beach Boy, you know? And we're not Beach Boys, you know? I mean, we just musicians, I guess. We joined the band after some of the cuts of Call and the Passions were cut already. Actually, we joined the band when we were in London. Came back and just recorded this album like so quick. And then we were out on the road and it seemed like we just stopped.
What were your tracks on Call and the Passions?
Hold On Brother and Yes She Comes. And they were just so far removed from what the Beach Boys were doing, it was embarrassing.
But presumably they left you to do them the way you wanted to?
That was really great about it. Because we had like 3 different studios going at the same time. Because Dennis was recording over there, and Carl and I was here, and Mike and I were, you know, it was just like we kept changing. You know, we just sleep and we go back and sleep and go back. But they left us to do entirely what we wanted to do. In fact, that's why it sounds so bad. No, really, I think if Carl had mixed it, it would have been really good, but it's just terrible. They let us learn.
It's fair to say, I think, that Carl and the Passions So Tough was relatively something of a disappointment when it was released. It certainly never attained the heights reached on the previous album, Surf's Up, but there were some nice things on it, like Cuddle Up, All This Is That, and this one, Marcella. Marcella, written by Brian Wilson and Jack Riley.
The title comes from Brian. It's about a girl who gave massages professionally in Los Angeles, named Marcella. I did the verses. The Hey Hey Marcella is Brian. Something's missing on it for me. It doesn't have that extra bit of energy.
Well, there's no doubt that some of Brian's energy at this time went into reactivating the group that his wife Marilyn and her sister had been involved in. Instead of the Honeys, the group were now called Spring. Brian wrote some of the songs for the album they recorded, provided some of the arrangement, did most of the production, and gave a lot of encouragement.
It really is practically all Brian's encouragement. See, Brian is always, I guess, related to, you know, making his music for his family. He's always telling me that he loves my voice. You know, and I tell him that I love his voice, but this is all genuine. And he loves maybe like 3 different voices. And when one of them's mine, that's got to be pretty, to me, that's got to be pretty good. I mean, if he loves my voice, You know, I mean, that makes me on top of the world. So it's all encouragement from him. And he loves the album. He says it's one of his favorite albums, and I know it. You know, he's very proud of it.
Good Time, an unmistakable Brian Wilson production by Spring, or American Spring as they were now called. Well, the next big move in the Beach Boys' career was the one that took them lock, stock and recording studio to Holland. The impetus for the move came mainly from Carl and from Jack Riley.
I wanted to do it. It seemed like an interesting place. But most of all, I thought that it was important for the Beach Boys to do a record outside of California, to get away from that whole scene, to find a new environment and create in that new environment. It would not have been effective had Brian not come over as well. He did, later than the rest, but he did come over. The project resulted in a spiraling dollar and cents, pounds and pence, guilders and cents commitment. I really can't tell you what the total figure was, but it depended on what you included. We built a new studio board, flew it over from California to Amsterdam. We had at one time, I think it was 12 houses, 18 cars, housekeepers, dogs, all sorts of things. For a while, we even had a little weekly news service that would just deliver inter-organizational news. There were so many of us over here. I think there were 40 or 50 at one time, including families. It was quite a wild and hairy scene. But I think that the result, the Holland album, was worth it. I personally have looked back on this thing a couple of times, I hope with some level of objectivity, and come to the conclusion that an album of that quality could not have been made in Los Angeles at that time in the group's career.
As Jack Riley mentioned, after a few false starts, even Brian managed to make the trip to Holland, and once there really enjoyed himself, as Marilyn recalls.
That was a vacation for us. We loved it. It was hard coming back. It was hard only because everything's slower, you know, you can relax and enjoy the air, which is something. Brian loved it. Oh God, he used to go on a bicycle, ride a bike every day. That's really something. It really is.
It may have been a holiday for Brian and Marilyn, but for the Beach Boys engineer Steve Moffat, the experience of moving from California to Holland was a harrowing one, to say the least.
The first I heard about it, Carl came in one night after a break and he said, think you can build a console in a month for us to go to Holland, you know, because Jack wanted to go to Holland. It was kind of a shock because I'd only been there like a couple of weeks, you know, and I said I'd look into it and see what we could do. I called a friend of mine, Gordon Rudd, who had been building consoles, and I talked to all the console builders in the city, and nobody would touch it in that time span. And we had worked together quite a bit in the past, building things, and I asked him if he would try it. Everybody else said at least 90 days, and we only had 2 months. By the time we got through planning, it was less than that. And we actually worked on putting the console together, this one, and all the other gear that goes with it. And we got it ready by June.
And after a few teething troubles, it all worked. The board itself is a masterpiece of electronic engineering, and when the Holland trip was all over, it was shipped piece by piece back to California and is now built into the Beach Boys' new studios in Santa Monica, along with the 24-track tape machine and enough electronic wizardry to produce any sound imaginable, and probably some that aren't. But was the stay in Holland all worth it? Carl Wilson.
Had we had time to think about it, I think maybe we would have decided against it for practical reasons, because it was really an expensive move on a business level, you know, to spend that much money to make a record doesn't make sense, you know, from that standpoint, but it was well worth it.
So the group returned to California, but Jack Riley enjoyed living in Amsterdam and for a while managed part of the Beach Boys' career from there. Eventually, though, this proved to be an unsatisfactory situation, and in October of 1973, they parted company.
I think the thing that caused me to pull away from the Beach Boys organization, not their music or anything else, but their organization, and that ultimately caused me to stay in Holland, was because of a terribly complex, complicated, and horribly distasteful situation involving aspects of their business and financial management. It was just raunchy. It was horrible and put a terrible amount of pressure on me in an area I had never thought in my life I'd have been involved in. They had, though, professionals from time to time. I think what they need is trust. They need to get somebody in there now who they can, number one, trust and has enough faith in the Beach Boys and enough creativity to go out there and do something about it. Because I think now they're at another one of those many strange points in their career where they're going to need a big boost.
Well, a few months after we recorded that interview with Jack Riley, in the early part of 1974, it was announced in Los Angeles that the new manager for the Beach Boys was to be James William Guercio, previously known as the mentor and manager of the group Chicago. In the meantime, Blondie Chaplin had left the group in December 1973 at the end of a most grueling tour and after having had various disagreements with the other members of the band. More surprising, though, was the departure a year later of Ricky Fataar from the group, since he had had a particularly good understanding with Carl Wilson, as we've already heard from Bruce Johnston. During the course of that year, a new double live album, The Beach Boys in Concert, had been released. It would be fair to say, I think, that the live album doesn't entirely capture the excitement or the quality of performance that you get at a Beach Boys concert, and was somewhat of a disappointment. Under the guidance of new manager James Guercio, it was reasonable to assume that the renewed impetus the group had gained through the success of the live performances would be backed up by some new studio recordings that would reaffirm their world-class status. Well, their work with Chicago on Wishing You Were Here and with Elton John on Don't Let the Sun Go Down was impressive enough. But sadly, their own latest album, 15 Big Ones, with the exception of the superb It's Okay, really doesn't have the vitality of their earlier recordings, or the verve and sophistication of some of their later ones. It's difficult to understand why a group who are still so hugely successful with their own older material at live shows should at this stage of their career make an album largely comprised of tame versions of other people's hits when they themselves have so often expressed a desire to be accepted for their newer music. It could be that this is a stopgap album recorded to partially fulfill their contractual obligations with Warner Brothers. Then again, maybe Brian Wilson's trying to tell us something in this self-penned song from the 15 Big Ones album.
He knows what he's doing. He knows. It's even hard for me to, understand what he's really doing, but he's got it all in his head.
Marilyn Wilson's reassurance about husband Brian is echoed by the other members of the group, so we can only hope that somewhere in the creative pipeline there are more gems to come from him. The sheer quality of much of Brian Wilson's output over the years, and the brilliance and the precision of the musical arrangements and vocal harmonies, is undeniable. Without doubt, the influence of the Beach Boys' music has been felt around the world, and nowhere more so than in their home country.
It's American music in the worst sense that every time you turn on the radio, you get a commercial for anything. It's an infringement on Brian Wilson's techniques and sounds and style. I mean, every commercial practically on AM, FM radio is a steal from Brian Wilson. Direct steal. That's in the worst sense. In the best sense, all the groups in America, all the groups that do vocal sounds, they've all borrowed his perfection at getting the sounds right and the harmonies right. The use of the bass, the use of the voices, the use of the breaks, the change of tempos, they've all borrowed from him. I mean, I think Brian Wilson changed the sound of American music for the next 30 years.